We are gonna get started, and we're here to talk about the situation where the affirmative is reading. It's just the affirmative is mainly reading a plan for the most part, not reading a critical no plan F. And the neg is going for a critique in how to debate framework in that situation. And so, what we're going to focus a lot of attention on is the AF side, and by doing that, it will become clear what the neg needs to do as well. And so that's how we're gonna start a lot with the AF, and then conclude with how the neg can circumvent and clash with this kind of maybe better AF approach. And by going through the AF thoroughly, it will kind of reveal all the kind of parts that the neg usually brings up and goes for as well. So to get into it, we need to take some steps back and kind of figure out what framework is for and what it is. And the main point is framework establishes a standard for evaluation. It gives you a way to make sense of competing claims and how to think about them, how to organize them, and how to value them. And generally speaking, it argues something should be prioritized over something else. So there's always a comparative element of framework. And this is one of the key parts that maybe is missing from your current AF framework interpretations or arguments, is that you're not giving the judge a way to evaluate competing arguments. You're not telling them what should be prioritized over something else. You're generally just asking them or requesting of them to do a particular action, which isn't really what a framework is. And so again, we're trying to think about the AF first, and so we need to understand what the neg is trying to accomplish when they're making framework arguments. And one of the main ones is a strategic impulse, which is that framework arguments are hard for the affirmative to answer. They're easy to drop. You can proliferate them, and you can do it with the last point about that. Number one is you can do it with no cost for the most part. It's hard for you to say, like, epistemology should be evaluated over something else, and then the AF can go all in on saying, no, if you ever put epistemology first, you automatically do terrible things unless the neg should lose, right? That doesn't really happen. That kind of like turn from the AF doesn't really happen. So it's very easy to proliferate arguments, and there's no cost, which is why the neg focuses a lot of attention on framework. But the other main reason, and this is where in a lot of practice debates that I've seen from the Georgetown camp and into the DDI as well, is framework interpretations are happening largely, without evidence. They're happening very theoretically on both sides, which isn't really how framework is supposed to work, because for the neg at least, they should be using framework to make it clear and to amplify how the alternative works and to make it so the alternative is largely a framework question. Most people should treat those things as almost interchangeable, where a lot of the reasons why the critique does something or voting neg does something is done on framework, and the alternative isn't a disjointed separate thing. And then the other strategic impulse is the neg, since they get pick the framework, is going to pick something where the ground is more favorable for them. It makes link arguments more important. It makes a part of the AF that maybe the AF is less ready to defend. It makes it more objectionable. It makes it maybe the focus of the debate. It makes it the pivot point. And this is generally how Neg Framework is to work, because they get to speak second, so they get to pick the framework, they can gear it towards something that's obviously a favorable prioritization or comparison for them. So this is what the neg is trying to do. They're trying to help out their alternative. They're trying to make the ground and the point of comparison for the debate something that favors them and disfavors the AF. And they might be trying to do this in a variety of ways. They may be proliferating these types of arguments because they are low cost options for the neg. So that's what the neg is trying to do. So now those things help us inform what we need to do when we're AFF, right? And so let's take stock of what we got going on right now. So in the chat, I guess, shoot me some of your, like if you were going to debate a critique right now and you're going to say something about framework in the 2AC, which I assume most every one of you would, mainly reflexively, even if you don't fully comprehend what you're saying, what would those things be? Put them in the chat so we can have a debate AFF versus alt. I need some more words than that. I don't think that's what you would say. Weigh the AFF, that's a very popular one. That's a classic one where, again, you're just telling the judge to do something. You're not really telling the judge, you're not really giving the judge something that they can use to prioritize or compare competing arguments. Framework, we get to weigh the AFF. See, not a framework, more like a desire, more like a wish. And they have to defend the alt as a test of a competitive opportunity cost. Again, not really a framework. That's just like, it's like standards. So it's like a rubric maybe to judge the debate on. It's not really a framework to use to evaluate the debate. Weigh the impacts of the AFF against the alt. Again, it's an instruction. It's not really a framework because it doesn't really tell the judge what to think about arguments. Like if they have one argument of one type and they have another argument of another type, the framework has to tell them what to do. Util does something. Util is a moral framework for sure, so it's closer. Existential risks, sure. It's just like an extreme version of util that works. Prioritize structural violence. Similarly, we're getting closer because we're saying prioritize certain things. Those arguments generally aren't necessarily framework arguments because those are just impact arguments. So it is like an impact framework, I would say, but it's not a broad enough framework to catch all the different kinds of competing arguments. Meet the burden of proof. I don't know what you mean by that. Prioritize the best policy option. Yeah. That used to be you did not get brought up in this era of debate, but a lot of judges and a lot of the debates were centered around policymaking frameworks and what was relevant for that policymaking decision. And that shaped how certain arguments got prioritized, how certain arguments got evaluated. So the policymaking framework is one. Problem solving is another. You might know it more in critical context as as problem solving frameworks. So I agree those are all things you say. I would say that those don't really provide a lot of frameworks. So here's the tricky part is, as far as these things go, there are lots of different kinds of arguments that could tell you how to think or understand or relate or prioritize competing information. And a lot of it doesn't require elaborate theory interpretations or theoretical debating or talking about typical debate standards. That is it more just, it requires identifying what the actual substance of the negs argument is and then coming up with something that competes with it. Here's a classic example. Fiat is not real is a common thing that happens in the framework section of these debates. People mention that fiat is not real. And so, but is it really a framework argument in the sense of, has it given the judge any information about how and why to prioritize certain sets of arguments over other sets of arguments? And in this case, it's really not. It's maybe a justification for some, but like in of it itself, fiat is not real could be a reason why a framework is relevant or a subcomponent framework is relevant. But in of itself, it doesn't do the framework function that we're looking for. So a lot of things get conflated in these situations, right? So again, let's evaluate a little bit more of the NEG frameworks so we can figure out what the AFF needs to do to resolve this. I'm asking a lot of rhetorical questions here on this slide. Is the judge saying that should not evaluate the effects of the plan a framework argument? Again, literally just telling the judge not to evaluate the plan is close. It's definitely an implication of frameworks, but as far as framework goes, I would say you need to make that statement a little clearer, and you need to say the reason why the plan shouldn't be evaluated or what needs to be prioritized before the effects of the plan, before you have a real understanding of, before you have a real kind of substantive framework argument. That slide didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. So framework when AFF. What do we need? What do we need? We need a standard to evaluate competing arguments. And we got to interact with all these neg arguments, all these different ways that they could prioritize other stuff, you know, methods and epistemology or ontologies, or all these other things that they could say is more important, representations, discourse. And then it gets even more granular when we're talking about particular impact arguments like the structural violence thing and other kinds of things that they could say are more important than the 1AC has presented. But here's the part about most frameworks, right? Where the way the AFF one is classic. The way the AFF one is responding to this neg argument, because the neg framework, a lot of people assume that don't think about the effects of the plan as the common implication of a neg framework, even though, I don't know, in a lot of the test cases at camp, at least for the last 4 or 5 weeks, I've seen that's not usually what the framework means. But weigh the AFF is just merely contradicting the neg. It's the opposite of what the neg said. But it's not necessarily furthering your goal. It's not problematizing what the neg is saying. It doesn't make it harder to be neg. It doesn't make it easier for the AFF to win. So we need to up the bar about what is an acceptable framework argument, because it has to do something. Like if the neg never brought up a framework argument at all, could you make a framework argument on the AFF and make it so you could win the debate on that argument, right? Like if the neg was never going to say any framework argument, you said weigh the AFF, and they were just like going for the cap K and like impact turning you, right? Then that doesn't really help you that much. So here is my proposition to the room, which I do not believe anyone said this as an example, even though we had quite a few examples in the Zoom chat, is only evaluate arguments that are based off the plan text. So this is a standard for evaluation because it asks the judge to ask a question of every argument, which is, does it stem from the action of the plan text or does it not? And if it doesn't, it shouldn't be evaluated. And if it does, it should be. What does it mean? What does it mean? The judge should start the way they're assessing the debate with assuming that the plan happens. That means the arguments that clash, that prove the plan desirable or undesirable, should be tied to, in some way, the action, effect, or results of the plan. Ooh, that was it. Let's go back and why is this framework good? Affirmative ground, like we said when we were evaluating the other frameworks. The goal of the AFF is to prove the plan is desirable. That is what the AFF's job is. It's generally, it used to be the resolution in its entirety, but then we decided we should parametricize resolutions, which means we just need to prove an example of the resolution good, and the AFF has met their burden. So when they propose a plan text, they are ready to, the AFF is saying, we think that this proves the resolution desirable against all competing things. We will defend the plan against all available opportunity costs or competitive options. And so that point of clash should be the most substantive because the AFF get to choose what they, right? They get, in theory, infinite prep time to pick their affirmatives. So they should have just spent all their time researching this one plan action that they have now proposed. And because of their rigorous research, they have weeded out all the competitive options and come up with defenses. So this comparative point, defending the plan action and the neg attacking the plan action should be the most clash-filled part of any debate, just because it's the most comparative and it's the most well-researched. This framework has the extra benefit of the neg needs to be direct and make arguments that are specific. It discourages arguments that don't have a direct point of clash or rely on a more obscure point. And this is based off a standard of evidence, which is debate should be about kind of the comparative clash, where the neg should be able to come up with competing options, and the AFF has ground to say that the neg is wrong, and then there's a in-depth back and forth. But where the neg gets to choose the framework, there's a self-serving element to, it's not that the AFF gets to choose whatever framework they want. Evaluating the effects of the plan is more in line with just the AFF is saying, if it's our burden to prove that this external thing is true, we didn't pick the resolution, then we should just start by assuming the action of the plan happens so we can evaluate whether the plan is desirable or not. And if the neg gets to pick another framework, that creates this door for this self-serving behavior, where this element of comparative clash is going to be diluted, because the neg gets to pick the locus or the stasis of all the clash, and it moves away from the resolution, which is externally placed on all the competitors in the debate, and rather whatever the neg chooses, this element of clash is going to go down. There's another kind of subsection of explanation for why this element of clash and this element of comparative back and forth is less good with neg theoretical frameworks. One issue is that they're debated in the abstract and they're not debated in context. They're not, let's see what this is, yeah. So it is, this is an argument that's particular to theory making, which is, should you take, the NEG's framework is kind of taking a specific, which is like the 1AC, and then generalizing to kind of a universal principle. And that is that's making their framework, and that's kind of the decision that they're presenting with the judge. And the AF would want to argue that it should be the opposite, that you should start with general theories, but you should then reveal whether those theories work or not in specific contexts, or if they're applicable in the specificness, in the specific instances. And so evaluating the plan is necessary for that. If you obscure, if you don't evaluate the way theories work in action or work in specific contexts, then you're just doing the generalized theory, which is not, which you're doing general theorizing, but you're not necessarily proving them against competing explanations unless you have case studies or test cases or data of some variety. And when I say data, I don't mean like numbers. I mean like examples, just kind of data in the sense of like a warrant or explanation, instances, discrete kind of events, etc., that you could use, that you could express quantitatively in data that the way you're thinking of them. But data has a broader meaning in this sense. And then the other issue is theory relies on, there's a point where you can't have comparative clash over theories because theories are generated through first assumptions. You have to, things are not self-evident. You can't just reason deductively to the bottom of anything. At some point, you have some things that are unknowable with a degree of certainty, and you just have to assume that one part of an explanation is true over another one, and then proceed from there. But if you're just making initial assumptions, leaps of faith, and things of that nature, there's not really much point to debate about them, since the choice can easily be made the other way, and it was just you had a hunch. And the only way to make sure your hunches are more accurate than other people's hunches is what we said in number one. And it can't be done in the abstract when you're just like debating ontologies generally. Because you can have a sense of an ontology that helps you understand the phenomena around you. I could have a different one. And the only way to really parse it is their accuracy in the specific context or their effects, whether they are good or bad, and things of that nature. Oops, there was a D. Yeah, we talked about this. This is allowing the point of comparison to be decided ex post, neg self-serving thing that we talked about before. There's more. Second reason is logic. Framing and thinking, I would say, and acting are not opportunity costs. And this is a particular to neg typical framework arguments. Any link that doesn't disprove, well, whoop, it's showing that I'm recycling this because this was about schools. I did this on the education topic initially, but any link that doesn't disprove the action of the plan is necessary is a reason to vote for the perm. And this is this classic competition stuff where the neg needs to prove the action of the plan is desirable, the AF needs to prove it is desirable. And you can think a lot about the world, and you can think particular action should be taken. And you can think particular action should be taken for a lot of different reasons, but they are not opportunity costs with one another. And again, arguing assumptions in the generic, where you cannot prove that, you know, if a plan has specific solvency and it is proven sufficient, but you're like, I don't know, a neoliberal could come along and advocate that for different reasons or the same reasons. And I don't know, it seems sketchy. It seems like your ideology, it seems like this action is compatible with a lot of different ideologies. For instance, a lot of different social systems have like schools, capitalist countries, Nazi Germany, communist countries, they all had schools. So when you try to talk about how education works and how to reform education, is the whole enterprise bankrupt because problematic people thought the same thing and they're like, oh yeah, you know, schools are a good idea. We should figure out this thing, how to indoctrinate people and things of that nature. No, you would not just like throw away schools because problematic people thought it was a good idea. And this is, again, why you have to evaluate the action in context. You can't divorce the effects of the plan and the action of the plan from all the things that could lead to arriving at the plan as a proposed action. I have no idea where this card came from, but under these circumstances, we as a society need all the help we can get. There's no monopoly on knowledge, and there's no guarantee that only one kind of knowledge generated and understood with any one epistemology or ontology is always and everywhere more useful than another. To assert otherwise is an act of supreme intellectual hubris. So that just speaks for itself right there. I don't know how often, if you have generic cards like this in your AFF framework repertoire that you slate for the 2AC, but cards like this are quite useful to say that these kinds of frameworks should not be zero sum. There are all kinds of ways to approach understanding the world and knowledge making and how to parse information and parse phenomena. But it doesn't mean that there should just be one in all contexts or one across all these different instances. We shouldn't treat them as zero sum. We should be like, this is maybe right in this context, this is maybe right in this other context, and proceed from there. 1 second, sorry. Okay. Problem with the neg frameworks. Let's go through it. They are self-serving. They happen after the fact of the 1AC. I think we kind of talked about this kind of logic where if it happens after the 1AC and the neg gets to pick it and they get to try to do it to maximize their competitive advantage, then that generally means that it's not going to be as clashable as something that is resolution centric, because the resolution is picked because it's a controversy. It has two sides. It's picked and it's imposed on everyone equally. So it's more reasonable to say that resolution centric arguments are going to produce more clash than alternatives. Yep, we talked about this one. Yeah, we kind of just talked about this, where the AF is their goal to prove desirable, and you're making arguments that aren't about the plan, then we are picking something that might be, it's not like it's totally irrelevant or totally nonsense or anything, but if the goal is to produce clash in debates, and it's also supposed to generate, people should have roughly an equal opportunity to win no matter what side they are, since they are forced to be on both sides. And then if then the side benefit should be kind of in-depth discussion, then keeping things centered on the thing that was designed for such a purpose, the resolution, is less self-serving in that capacity and would solve those things better. They are regressive. Regressive means becoming less advanced, less developed, less nuanced, things of that nature. And they're regressive when they undermine clash and the back and forth depth and makes things less substantive, produce superficial conversations. You undermine clash when you say something needs to be prioritized over something else, but that point of comparison doesn't really exist in the literature. The evidence you provide for such a justification, it's not a zero sum as the way that teams in debates present it, right? This part that's zero sum, that is clear sequencing questions. Lots of academics and lots of literature bases aren't competing with each other because of evidence like the card we said above. They're like, oh, in this instance, this makes sense. Or all of these things can exist in productive tension with each other, or they can be closely related, but they don't have to overlap, or they don't, not all these schools of thought have to be absorbed into one blob, which is kind of how Neg frameworks work, but it's not how academics work. And the key part is that the assumption that there is going to be it's going to be a superficial discussion and possibly an unfair discussion if the assumptions behind the way the argument works in debate are never assumed by anyone outside the debate. That means the debate is going to be distorted. It's going to be less, there's a missing alignment. And that means the debate is going to be more superficial because people are making stuff up and it's not backed in evidence and things like that. Which is what we generally want for high school debate, because no offense to anyone in this room, you all are like 16 and 17. No one really cares about your opinions. Debate is good because you go read other people's opinions and debate about them, and then you kind of formulate your own provisional opinions, and that's kind of the goal. But if you are making stuff up and then you're debating things that are only tangentially related, and then who knows what you're thinking about those debates, that kind of doesn't get out all of them. That's not great. And then obviously self-serving stuff to be undermine class. We already talked about that. Superficial. Yeah. Superficial because the neg can get super specific because they can just make it ad hoc. They can make a bunch of arguments cost-free. They can do it after us and then say we're never specific enough, say the AF is never specific enough, even though that there's not really evidence about this point of comparison. Opportunity cost logic, again, I got surveillance in here now, so who knows when these slides, who knows how many times these slides have been redone. Zero sum logic bad. That's kind of one of the classic themes if you should be picking up on. And another idea is cherry picking, because whether an idea is usually good or bad always kind of reduces down to, or boils down to, eventually gets at, what causes what. Link debate, solvency, link debating, same kind of idea. Probability of solving, magnitude of impact, things of these natures. That's what it always comes down to. And assuming that you can have these kind of conversations in artificial vacuums, not great. Not great. Superficial in the sense that because something has been unnecessarily forced upon the conversation, it makes it not reflective of how things actually work. That's what I mean by superficial. So here's some things the neg is going to say if you're bringing up these arguments. Opportunity costs, logic, self-serving, client-centric framework, improves clash, things of that nature. They're going to say that you just arbitrarily write out all kinds of dissents. You just bracket out all these kinds of arguments, which is not true because, again, it's not the case that debate just needs to have all. It's kind of like when you're neg going for framework. It's not that the conversations are worth having. It's not like the argument is necessarily incorrect. It's just what is subject to debate, particularly switch side debate in this competitive format. And so it's not like the AFF precludes criticism. You can criticize the actions of the plan. You can also criticize what is behind the plan insofar as the actions manifest for particular reasons. This is what if the neoliberal version of the plan is substantively different than the socialist version of the plan, then you might have an argument. You just have to win that the AFF was actually the neoliberal version of the plan, and the way the AFF worked precluded ever considering the socialist version of the plan, because then you get like a perm issue, right? And then it obviously this begs the question, this presumes an impact, but again, what is debate for? Is it for maximizing clash while maintaining an equal opportunity for each side to win, the AFF and the neg? This is a classic one. Be responsible for the whole winning C. The plain text is 3 seconds. Like, what's up? That doesn't make any sense. And again, like I said, we've been going on. In general, debating things in a vacuum, debating things at a high level of abstraction are bad. Debating things in context, debating things in a propositional context is good. And the other thing, which I don't know if this slide is going to say it. No, it's not going to say it. The other thing is that just because the plain text is technically 3 seconds, that does not mean that the action or the result of the plan was 3 seconds. You actually talked for 8 minutes about the actions and the results and the effects of the plan. That was on every page. That's what solvency is. That's what the links to the advantages are, et cetera, et cetera. The impacts are just what those effects are. So no, this is wrong. It's not that. The plan, the action of the plan is obviously the entire one you see. And then, they're going to say something comes first, ideology, epistemology, or whatnot. There's a couple of things. Mainly, it depends what kind of evidence or what is substantiated for this argument. It's seldom the case that their evidence is so good that the bar is literally, you should ignore some other stuff prioritize this over this. Though that's a card that's an argument that is frequently made, but is not substantiated with evidence. Usually it just says it's important to consider these kinds of things. And you can do that with permutations. You can do that with maintaining actions of the plan. You can say why you just have to tie it to the actual plain text and what the action is, instead of just arguing it in a vacuum or something that is not intrinsic to the plan. And again, what you want to go for, and probably with a piece of evidence, you want to say that the neg is promoting this zero-sum way of theorizing. And you can make general arguments, like analytical theory style arguments about why that's problematic, and then you can read substantive cards that these kinds of academic theorizing is not very good. And that's the way you want to approach answering some of these framework arguments. Classic, like, fiat's not real, you can't do the plan, like, what's up? Never really understood this argument as a reason to vote against the AFF or why it was offense or anything, because obviously if debate is to make a Well, it's like the point of the debate is to judge the debating. So you don't need the plan to happen to judge the debating. You can imagine that the plan happens, and then you can debate about it, and then whoever did the debating wins. That seems, so this argument is really a kind of a non sequitur. But even if you want to take it further than that, it's just like a mode of analysis. You can evaluate whether something is good or bad without ever having the agency to do it. Like if I don't have money, I can still do an analysis of whether it's a better idea to like take a European vacation or a Japanese or go to Japan or something, because I can do that because I have a brain and I can just look at the cost and benefits and I can apply critical thinking and I can apply the process of the things that debate teaches you to make the decision, even though I never had the agency, but I could still have a debate about that with another person and things like that. So having agency to enact the plan doesn't really matter for whether you can assessing whether something is desirable or not desirable, which is the whole point of debate in the first place. Like we talked about at the top, AFF says desirable, NEG says not desirable. Like, yeah, simulation is a practice of agency. People do this all the time. People do it in the real world. People do it in debate. It seems completely benign. And then obviously, yeah, the implication of this argument is that the alternative, the NEG might have some kind of agency over the alternative, but if you prove the alternative is bad in some way or doesn't do something that's good, then it kind of complicates this whole logic of fiat not being real matter in the first place. But remember, I don't know what this. Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree with this, I guess, from yesteryear me. I don't know why this is a whole slide, but you generally, oh, that's true. People, okay, yeah. I guess the main point is I guess the main point of this slide is like you have this thing where you like have the way the 1AC thing, and then you have this like rant for like the 1AR maybe, or maybe you say in the 2AC too. You invoke like ideas about fairness, or you invoke ideas about who knows, you know what kind of prescripted crap I'm talking about. And you just read that kind of unreflexively, whether the NEG has like made good framework arguments or even made framework arguments or seem to be even trying or being strategic. Like I said, if the NEG isn't really being like, screw the 1AC because this thing is more important, then, and they're just like saying the role of the judge should be to like think about this thing as more important. So it's kind of like a impact request by the NEG, which is a frequent one that happens without any evidence. Then you don't need to go through all of this like bells and whistles and stuff. You just need to answer the argument in less terms. So you have this kind of, everything we kind of laid out previously is kind of a repertoire. You don't have to say it every time. You don't have to say it. You don't have to list it all. You need to tailor what is going on to the particular situation, I guess is the impact of what that slide was. So now let's pivot a moment to talk about the NEG side. Your goals. You want to nullify most of the 1AC. You want to make objections to the alternative less relevant. You want to bolster the ability of your alternative to solve something, your impact, their impacts. And you want to make the perm not make any sense. Because if the if you have correctly characterized on framework that prioritizing ideology is important, and then on like link arguments, you have, the permutation would be a jettisoning of something that is framework basically shapes what the judge thinks is an intrinsic part of the AF or being AF. And then it makes it so on the perm, you can say that they are severing or jettisoning a key comparative part of the clash that's shaping the whole debate. And then they're just jettisoning and changing the reasons they're doing stuff all willy-nilly. And if the reasons people do things is as important as the thing itself, then we have a problem. So you can complicate perms. You should be explicit. And again, you want to create a standard. So you want to say how arguments should be evaluated, what arguments should come before others, and things of that nature. You want to be explicit in your prioritization. You want to make a prioritization argument, and you want to be explicit about what it is. You don't want to make it confusing or unclear about how it applies across a wide swath of solvency, advantage, link, uniqueness, impact calc style claims. And then you want to focus on common justifications for for what the AFF is going to do. And you want to just kind of have a kind of broad critique that ties into you want to have a broad framework that kind of ties into what the substance of your critique is, that amplifies what your link arguments are going on about. And then you want to maybe impact turn kind of independently some of their stuff like problem solving theory. If you have a problem solving theory bad card, critical theory good card, that's a very kind of useful catch-all to have when you're neg on framework. And then you want the focus of the debate to be beneficial for you. You want to pick less of the 1AC. You want to agree with parts of the 1AC. This is maybe setting up a floating pick style argument, but you want to narrow the debate onto a question that is not very favorable for the AF and favorable for yourself. And you want it, obviously, especially if it's supposed to help your alternative, the alternative and like what the framework is should be, they shouldn't be like a wide departure, right? So like if the framework is all talking about like intellectual analysis and epistemology, and the alt was like literally abolish prisons, like be a mass movement, whatever, it's like, how do those work? It makes more sense if the AF is like kind of an individual academic, and then you just say what's the best way to do that kind of work on framework, and then you got something. And then obviously should be with link arguments, because you want to critique maybe a certain part of the 1AC instead of like the totality of the 1AC or the plan, because then you would more be reading a disad. And then you want the framework to make the importance of that link argument go up substantially, because it's not like the AF is going to literally contradict every possible link argument you have available to you. That's not usually how it works with critiques. And yeah, like we said that on kind of above, that you want to take the F defenses of focusing on the plan text, overly focusing on the plan text, this kind of policy making framework or problem solving framework, and you want to say that creates its own problematic trade-offs. It compromises things on permutation and things of that nature. You want to generate some kind of trade-off disad about why, that kind of framework, what that framework's blind spots are, and things of that nature. So, and that is kind of independent of, like, your critique might not have been very focused on things of that nature, like pragmatism or policy making or things of that nature. You might not have, that might not have come up initially, but you can kind of just, if they kind of said that stuff is good. Another one is kind of methodological pluralism or eclecticism. If you can kind of say that's problematic for whatever reason, the AF will be kind of tied and stuck to it, since that's the main defense of why we should focus on the effects of a plan and things of that nature. And so if you impact turn it, that's just kind of like offense for you that came out of nowhere. I think that was it. So that is the long and short of it, I will say. I am happy to answer any questions we have with the few minutes we have remaining. If any parts of that need clarification. I will agree, it was very thorough and very convincing all at the same time. Pretty much the golden combo of efficient and compelling. So your silence and all your masked and muted faces they make a lot of sense in this context, because I really killed it for the last 45 minutes, I will say.
Hey, I have a quick question. So you said like on one of the answers for like you said that the neg will say like that the app has to be like responsible for the whole 1AC. And then one of your answers against that were that the affirmative talked 8 minutes about the results of the plan. So then wouldn't that sort of be like confirming what the negative has said when you said like you technically then are responsible for the 1AC in the AF answer that you said, right?
Yeah. that kind of begs the question though of what they mean, because they're going to be like the reasons that these arguments are included in the 1AC, like the reasons why this argument was in the 1AC, or why this justification over this other justification, or the way to think about those reasons, whatnot, right? Like not the plan is bad per se, but you know, doing the plan for the wrong reasons is bad, right? Which isn't, which is to say that, you know, disagreeing with the way that people think about climate change doesn't make climate change any better, right? If they're like representation critiquing that, and it doesn't take away from the fact, it doesn't say that the plan's action, it doesn't clash directly with whether the plan is desirable or not, was kind of my point, even though mostly it was just you want to counter some of that rhetoric that's like, oh, you boiled down an 8-minute speech to a 3-second thing. It's like, no, not really. Like justifying the plan is obviously more than a 3-second process. But I don't know if that necessarily opens your door that you have to like defend representations as explicitly per se, because again, a lot of the part you when you're AF, you want to frame the neg as putting like words in your mouth or forcing like the worst case interpretation of the AF and the 1AC in the plan, and then the neg critiques that when that's not really intrinsic or an essential part of the 1AC, if that makes sense. Can you explain the part about how simulation is a practice of agency? Well, people do it. People simulate choices all the time in courses of action, and just whether they're good or bad. Sometimes even when they have no ability to do the decisions. Like, should your favorite basketball team trade for this player or this player? Or what would it look like if this player signed with my favorite basketball team in the off season? What would that look like? And then sometimes even they go and test it on like a video game, which I guess is closer to enacting it. But simulation and imagining certain things happen and what their effects were, and then rewinding and then imagining a different set of actions, what those effects are, that is agency, insofar as it is a way to help better understand the world around you and the phenomena and some whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I hope that clarifies why it's a practice of agency. Okay, I have to do another one of these at 11, so I'm gonna call it here and have fun at your next elective.